The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMSI.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Humanity First. My name is Peter Evers, and we are in for a great conversation and a very timely one this week because it is Juneteenth, the newest federal holiday as of 2021, and something that perhaps people didn't talk about at all prior to that very much. This, of course, is the holiday that celebrates the end of slavery, but really was the beginning of another struggle for equal rights and equal pay for Black Americans. It's important that we have this discussion in a broader sense, relative to human rights in this country, and making sure that everybody is heard and everybody is at the table. And I think the big message for me is that as we strive for equality, it doesn't mean that another group of people lose anything. The more equality there is, the better our society is. And we're going to talk with Felicia Heywood and Sonia who work at BAMSI in our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion department. We're going to talk about the history of Juneteenth because it's always interesting, but we're actually also going to talk about how the interest in civil rights over America's history has waxed and waned in a way that is pretty much entwined with the interest in Juneteenth. So I'm really looking forward to those folks coming on, and we'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Jamie. I'm an essential worker here at BAMSI, and I'm a nurse. Nurses are essential here at BAMSI because as nurses, we really have the opportunity to make an impact. We have very small ratios, so we have the opportunity to really learn everything about the person served and be able to give the best care. It really serves such a great purpose for me as being a nurse and really why I came into nursing. Learn more about nursing opportunities at bamsijobs.org.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMSI.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Humanity First. My name is Peter Evers from BAMSI, and we have a great session this afternoon. We're going to be talking about Juneteenth, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, and who better to have that conversation with than BAMSI's DEI specialists. We have Felicia Heywood. Hi, Felicia. How are you doing?
Hello. Thank you for having me.
And I think this is the third time that you've been on the podcast. And Sonia Delacco, who is our VP of DEI. Hi, Sonia. How are you doing?
Hello. Thanks for having me.
And for those who don't know Sonia over the last 4 or 5 years has been a real influence on pushing forward at our organization the issue of equity and inclusion and social justice. And many of the time we've had a conversation about the work that we do at BAMSI is really entwined with social justice. It is hard to imagine doing anything in our space, which is human services, which doesn't relate back to the issue of social justice and human rights. So the timing is good as well because we are approaching Juneteenth, which is now a national holiday with the exception of, I think, 5 states, one of which is New Hampshire, which is a little weird because it's only just north of us. But the Dakotas, I think, and Hawaii are the other ones, and I forget the other one. But I thought it would be good to talk a little bit about the history of Juneteenth because it's one of those things that waxes and wanes, isn't it, in America's consciousness. And Felicia, maybe tell us a little about the history.
Sure. And I'd like to start by picking up a little on what you said, Peter, which is the way things wax and wane. So I think when we talk about Juneteenth, we have this idea that there was this proclamation and then everyone was free and it was all good, as opposed to it just really started the challenges. But briefly, Juneteenth became celebrated. So let's go into the Civil War. And then there's the Emancipation Proclamation from Abraham Lincoln in 1963 that became official January 1st, 1963, which is 1863, thank you, which essentially said all former slaves are now freed.
Right.
However, this is back in the 1800s. This is before we have YouTube and Facebook and all of these ways of getting information out quickly. So the information sort of trickled out about the Emancipation Proclamation, and it wasn't the end of the Civil War. The Civil War continued for another 2 years. And even after General Lee surrendered, which most people think of as being the end of the Civil War, there were still skirmishes happening. And in fact, what was happening more and more is as the Union armies were occupying a place, they could put in effect this Emancipation Proclamation. But the Confederate armies continued to move to try to outpace them, and they ended up in Texas. So Texas was really sort of the last bastion of slavery.
And Texas was one of those states that was really not affected terribly by the Civil War, right? And so business as usual, right?
Yeah, and in fact, there were only about 250,000 enslaved people in Texas at the time. But so the Union Army is moving out, trying to get to places, spread the good word. They finally get to Texas in 1863, and it's General Order Number 3, which was the proclamation essentially letting those 250,000 enslaved people in Texas know that they were, in fact, quote unquote, freed.
Yeah, let's talk about quote unquote. I'm really glad you sort of mentioned that, and Sonia, just bringing you in here. You know, when you look back at the history of it, it's not like, you know, oftentimes you look back and you read about history, says, oh, okay, so the proclamation was made and everybody was happy ever after. Not quite, right? I mean, I remember one of the things that that African Americans did in relation to white racism, which was this idea of disrupting the idea of celebrating Juneteenth, was buy land, right? Which is something that hadn't happened. This was still a struggle, right, Sonia?
Yes, yeah. After the Emancipation Proclamation and the finally ensuring the freedom of all enslaved folks, there was still a lot of struggle. Initially, there was the formerly enslaved people were able to make some gains in society, but that was very quickly sort of pushed back down with Jim Crow laws and ways to sort of pull any advancements that were made right out underfoot. And before even getting there, of course, folks that were formerly enslaved had no material wealth accumulated, had, no employment to just step right into other than potential sharecropping. So yeah, it wasn't like, okay, everybody's free now, everything's beautiful.
Right, and the struggle began, and there's a real through line there. I'm glad you brought that up, Sonia. There's a real through line from the idea of generational wealth, and that really has come through to present day. I was reading something the other day about the average wealth of a Bostonian, if they're white or black, and that differential still exists. And it's important, I think, sometimes to recognize that this isn't something that happened overnight. This is something that is the direct result of one race of people oppressing another.
Yeah, so I thank you for that, Peter. I really want to pick up on this idea of sharecropping, because of course you have these people who were formerly enslaved who had no, as Sonia said, no material wealth. So how were they going to move about? So part of the Emancipation Proclamation that maybe a lot of people don't know was this real advice to formerly enslaved people to stay where they were and to work on their land because now they were employees and they should be getting paid. Well, you might imagine that people who formerly had enslaved people didn't suddenly say, let me start paying you.
Let me rebudget, right?
Let me pay you a fair wage. Let me make sure it's a living wage. And then we have a cost of living increase every year. Like that just didn't happen. So we got into this idea of sharecropping where they would essentially contract with the former owners and work the crops for a share of the crops. But that whole system really ended up with a lot of people in debt to their former owners, right? So this idea of now that you're freed and can work in theory for a wage, you still really can't get ahead. You really can't get traction financially.
Yeah, and that process sort of repeats itself as well. Let's talk about this sort of the interest in Juneteenth over a few generations, right? And I read this article that in Texas in 1880, I saw an advertisement in a local Houston paper that was talking about a Juneteenth sale. Right? I mean, was that embedded in the society that there was a Juneteenth sale, like President's Day, right? So that didn't last, right? There was after that there was sort of more disruption, and that Sonia was talking about a little bit. But there were also world wars that sort of, you know, maybe pushed that down a bit. But does that, I'll ask both of you, does that sort of directly correlate with civil rights issues over the ensuing century and a bit?
Sure. I can start, Sonia, if that, okay. I think absolutely it does. And I think when you have a country that's going through not only the wars, the First World War and the Second World War, all the other wars, but also a Great Depression, there were just factors that were creating priorities in other areas. And I think much like, so it fell out of favor a little bit. The celebrations stopped a bit. I think when at the end of World War II, when we saw veterans coming back, especially Black veterans coming back and really saying, like, I'm going to demand my rights here. I just fought for this country. So you saw the rise of the civil rights movement. And then you started to see a return of celebrating Juneteenth. And I do want to say one thing going back to this concept of owning land, because Emancipation Park in Texas is actually bought by formerly enslaved people for the specific reason of celebrating Juneteenth there.
Yeah. Sonia.
Yeah, and I'll just to bring it forward to present day a bit, although, you know, it was always, Juneteenth was always important to the descendants of formerly enslaved people, you know, and it was celebrated, I mean, immediately as early as the following year after the General Order Number 3. And then, of course, the disruptions like Felicia was mentioning. But although it's been widely, first more in Texas, but then more widely celebrated by descendants of formerly enslaved folks, it wasn't as much on the radar of other Americans, I think, until following the murder of George Floyd, sort of the racial reckoning that was happening. And then in 2021, when President Joe Biden actually signed it into law as a federal holiday, then the Juneteenth became more of a you know, household name, you know, something that folks talked about across racial spectrums.
So,
and
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
If I might pick up on that. So I love that you shared that, Sonia, because also it now has become not just a celebration, but really something that we use to spark dialogues about things that were formerly taboo, like race and racism, to talk about.
That was going to be my next question. Felicia, we've been working together too. Yeah, my question is, okay, we've got this national holiday status, with the exception of 5 states, one of them being New Hampshire, and which is generating dialogue. But we're also existing in a time where often we despair about that, about the division in our country, and many of those divisions are around race, right? Around this idea of white privilege, around this idea of people losing something perceptively relative to somebody else gaining something. How do those things, this is a bigger question than this, but how do those square? You know, are we making progress with this? Are we having good dialogues with this? How can we counteract some of the hatred that is out there? Because that's what it is, right? And some of the desire to keep things as they are. How do we square that with this, with the racial reckoning that Sonia talked about? Where are we? I mean, are we making progress? Are we fighting a rearguard action? Where are we?
Sure. So I feel a little bit like I'm repeating something from the past, but I continue to make this point because I think it's important. We are seeing an incredible rise in backlash to the gains that have been made through the civil rights movement and since the racial reckoning. And I always say that backlash is a good barometer of how much progress we've made. So as we start to see more and more people coming out and demanding things don't change and trying to bring us back, you know, make America great, like back in the good old days, to me, that's a sign that we've made a great deal of progress in a way that all growth is uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So some people are uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I think what is still there to be made as a case is this idea that for some folks to get their rights, other folks lose their rights.
Right.
And I think as much as we can continue to understand that when anyone's elevated, we're all elevated
Right.
together, is really a part of the work that's ahead of us.
Yeah, I love that Torah expression, which says when one person is oppressed, everybody is oppressed, and it's probably a good place to start, right? You know, Sonia, you were mentioning around this issue. Well, we talked about the through line, and I remember when the murder of George Floyd happened, and we had a couple of speakers in, and I can't remember if it was Michael Curry or Professor
Kelly Carter Jackson.
Yeah, I think it was actually Carter Jackson who talked about this idea as not seeing what is happening now just through a present lens, but seeing it through history. And I've seen and I've worked with people who probably have been quite racist and quite prejudicial, who begin to get an understanding of oppression through an understanding of history. And that's not unusual with anything, right? So in that sense, that's the importance of Juneteenth, right? That you will probably be able to go into a place now with a group of people and people go, oh yeah, Juneteenth, as opposed to even 2 years ago, I think, where people go, you know, I did learn something today, by the way. Juneteenth is a portmanteau. So remember that, everybody. It's a mixture of June and the 19th. I didn't know portmanteau was a word, but there you go, it is. But as well as that, people maybe get a little window into a better understanding of the history of America and how America was made great in the first place, right?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting to me, this idea of using the celebration to say this history will not be erased, right? We're also living in a time where we're starting to see folks pushing back on what we're teaching in schools in terms of history. So, you know, the need to elevate this holiday is a way of just continually saying, we will not allow this to be erased. When you started, Peter, and you made a joke about the Juneteenth sale, there was a part of me that thought, well, thank goodness, like that makes it a real holiday when we get the T-shirts in various stores. And
that's another American story.
Yeah, it's just another story once there's a mattress sale that day. So yeah, I think that, yeah, that importance continues as a way to keep our history alive.
Yeah,
And I'd like to,
yeah, go ahead.
I just want to pick up on what you're saying, Felicia, about education. And just that, I think in the US, sort of the way US history has been taught for decades, for centuries, has been from a very particular perspective and has not been inclusive of everyone's experience and the true history of this country. And we're at a point now where that's beginning to change. But again, the backlash is pulling back on that. But just that importance of learning about the historical context, it really frames the present day oppressions to really understand all those nuances of the historical context.
Yeah, and we've talked before, and Felicia, I've told you about this, that when I did my social work degree, there was a young lad, 18 or something, Dave, who was from Lancashire, whose father was down the coal mines, and you know, he had suffered as a working class individual in Britain, which is a very sort of classist society. And he would begin by saying, what do you mean? Not only black people have been oppressed. What about me down the pit? But involving people in that conversation and recognizing that, but also putting it in the context of, yes, but you weren't a black person that was working down the pit because you might not have been paid in the first place, right? But it is important to have that conversation, I think, in the scheme of things, and that's what helps people realize that they are co-conspirators in a fight for justice, right? As opposed to splitting, which is what happened, one group against another, and I think that's an important conversation too.
Yeah, I agree, and I think at the same time helping people to see how forward movement anywhere helps us all along. So one example that I'm particularly fond of is this idea of accommodations. And so once upon a time when you go into a store, there'd be a door, you'd open the handle, you go into the store or not. Nowadays, you go to a store, it's very wide open and they open automatically. And very few of us think about the fact that those doors are wide and they open automatically for us. But that was the result of making things more accessible for some group of people. So there's really a lot of work to be done just to show us all how all of these benefits truly make things better for all of us.
Yeah, that is, all boats rise. And that has to be the message for Juneteenth. And I'm just glad that we're having a conversation about this. 10 years ago, probably nobody would be paying any attention to it. There's a lot of terrible things that happened in the last decade. There's no question about it, politically and all sorts of reasons. But we are talking about this, and we're raising consciousness of it, and we're engaging in a conversation about the future of America. So I really appreciate you coming on. We're running out of time as usual, but this is always a conversation that we can pick up again. Thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.